You know, the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War was a moment that forged a nation. And it's a story many of us think we know. But how we remember it, well, that's been shaped as much by movie theaters as by history books. So today, we're going to dig into the huge gap between the real complex roles women played in that war and how they were shown on the big screen for decades after.
Okay, so to really get the films, you first have to understand the official story they were pulling from. This quote right here, it's from the mainstream history. And I want you to pay close attention to the words. 3 million men are called martyrs, right? But the sacrifice of 200,000 women is framed as a loss of Ijit, a loss of chastity. This is not just semantics, it's the entire framework. It centers a woman's whole value on her perceived purity. And that one choice sets the stage for absolutely everything that follows.
And this is where the story gets really tragic. After the war, the government actually tried to do something honorable. They gave women who were victims of sexual violence the official title Birangona. It literally means heroine, an amazing gesture, right? But in a deeply patriarchal society, the word's meaning got twisted. It stopped being a title of honor and became a label, a different way of saying dishonored woman. A word that was meant to be a badge of honor became a mark of shame.
So the big question is, how did Bangladeshi cinema take this incredibly complex, painful history and put it up on screen? This is where it gets fascinating, because the way they told the story wasn't static at all. It changed, and changed dramatically over the years.
Okay, so this whole story on screen, it didn't happen all at once. It came in these really distinct waves. First up, in the 70s, right after the war, the movies are all about rape, and a lot of the time it was used to sell tickets. Then you get the 80s, and an alternative film scene keeps the victim story going, but maybe with less of the commercial angle. And then something really weird happens in the 90s. Women practically vanish from the conflict on screen. Finally, we hit the 2000s, and a new, much more subtle kind of objectification takes over. Let's break each of these down.
All right, let's dive right into that first wave of films. These were made in the immediate, raw aftermath of the war. And this period, well, it pretty much set the template for how women would be seen in war films for years and years to come.
And if you look closely at these films, you start to see this set of unwritten rules. First off, women were almost always just passive victims of sexual assault. Second, the rape scenes weren't just part of the story, they were often sensationalized, used to get people into the theater, a disturbing trend that's been called rape commerce. A woman's body literally became a symbol for the violated nation. And finally, the story's conclusion for her was always brutal and clear. She had to die, go insane, or just disappear from the story.
This line of dialogue from a movie made in 1974, it's just chilling. It's so direct. You see, the character isn't just a victim of an enemy soldier. She's a victim of a whole society that taught her to see herself as impure, as unworthy of even living. So the movies weren't just showing this happening to them. They were making the characters say it out loud, believe it themselves, and in doing so, they reinforced that horrible stigma for everyone watching.
So after that first wave of really brutal, explicit films, you have to ask, did things get any better? Well, better isn't really the right word. They definitely changed. Let's take a look at what happened next.
After a short period in the 80s where independent filmmakers kind of kept the passive victim story going, mainstream cinema in the 1990s found a new solution. Instead of actually wrestling with the difficult, traumatic topic of sexual violence, they just wrote women out of the war zone entirely. It made for a much more comfortable story, one that neatly avoided all the shame and trauma tied to the Birangonas.
And this slide, wow, it really lays out the difference in black and white. In the 70s, a woman's role on screen was the rape victim, there to create shock value and sell tickets. Fast forward to the 90s, and her role is the domesticated woman, there to create a safe, traditional story. She goes from being a nurse or a civilian in the middle of the fighting to being a silly girlfriend or a praying mother, tucked away safely at home. The problem of how to show her was solved by just making her invisible to the conflict.
All right, let's jump forward to the new millennium. Because here, the story shifts again. This time, it becomes something way more subtle, but you could argue just as confining. To really understand what's happening in modern Bangladeshi war films, we need to grab a tool from film theory. It's called the male gaze. Basically, it's the idea that the camera, and therefore the audience, is often forced to see female characters from the perspective of a straight man, which turns them into objects to be looked at, instead of people with their own stories.
It works through 3 coordinated looks. First, you have the look of the male character on the screen looking at the woman. Second, you have the look of the camera itself, which often pans over or lingers on the female body.
And third, there's the look of us, the audience, as we're invited to see her in the exact same way. The result is what the film theorist Laura Mulvey famously called to be looked atness.
So, what did this actually look like in the movies? It meant the explicit rape scenes of the 70s were largely gone. The lead actress's chastity was now protected. But, and this is a huge but, she was still being commercialized. Not through violence anymore, but through this constant, sexualizing gaze that made her an object of desire for the entire film. Which brings us to the core question of this whole explainer. Why? Why for decades were women shown as victims or made invisible or turned into sexualized objects, but almost never as the active fighters and organizers that they actually were in reality?
Well, a big part of the answer lies in this concept called the culture industry. The idea is that pop culture, movies, music, all of it, isn't just art. It's a commercial product, manufactured like something in a factory. And to make sure it makes a profit, the industry relies on standardized, safe formulas that have been proven to sell, instead of taking big creative or social risks.
So you basically had this perfect storm of three powerful forces that came together to create this distorted picture on screen. 1. Profit. The film industry is a business, and it used tropes it knew would sell tickets, whether that was shock or sex appeal. 2. Patriarchy. The movies were simply a mirror, reflecting a society that saw rape as a woman's shame. And 3. Official history. The filmmakers were just following the story they were given, a historical record that had already downplayed or completely erased women's roles as fighters.
And the result of these forces is, well, it's staggering. It took 40 years before a major Bangladeshi film finally showed a woman as a direct freedom fighter. For 4 decades, that entire part of the nation's story was almost completely invisible on screen.
And this leaves us with a really important question to think about. Cinema doesn't just reflect our history. In a lot of ways, it creates our collective memory of it. So when we watch a film that claims to tell a nation's story, we always have to ask, who gets to be the hero? And maybe more importantly, who gets written out of the script?